Although the war had started years earlier, protests finally began to pick up in 1964. By this time, protests against the war had reached the streets of several cities, with the Progressive Labor Party and the Organization of Young Socialists leading the demonstrations. One way that these groups protested was by publicly burning draft cards at rallies. That action was later found to violate the Selective Service Act and not be protected by the First Amendment during a 1968 Supreme Court case. By 1965, the movement was gaining momentum on college campuses, specifically at schools like Kansas University, the University of Michigan, and Cal Berkeley. At these campuses, there were many draft card burning demonstrations, along with teach-ins that aimed to educate the public on why the war was not good. Additionally, in September of '65, a Green Beret sergeant quit, and later a doctor also quit. These stories continued to contribute to the sense that the war was wrong and unjust. In 1966, many stories come out of Vietnam that further encouraged the public to dislike the war. For example, the public learns about the Search and Destroy campaign and the burning of South Vietnam villages and farmland. These stories were supported by the Fort Hood Three, which were a group of 3 privates who announced that they could not fight in an immoral war. Furthermore, the French President Charles de Gaulle called on the U.S. to leave Vietnam. During 1967, many prominent Democrats such as Robert Kennedy and Eugene McCarthy demanded talks for peace. Religious groups also called for fasts for peace and encouraged peace in the region. During this year, Republican candidate Richard Nixon famously stated that the protests only extended the war. However, protesters were even joined by Vietnam veterans in major cities across the nation to call for peace in response to his words. This year is also the year when boxing champion Muhammad Ali rejected his own draft call as a conscientious objector. Furthermore, Governor Ronald Reagan of California also called on the government to leave Vietnam. This year concluded with 4 days of major anti-war protests in New York City. In 1968, images and footage of the Tet Offensive shocked Americans with bloody scenes of the wounded and killed American soldiers. Additionally, the famous photo of an alleged Viet Cong captain's public execution circulated across the country, with further showcased the horrors of war. This year also brings about the news of the My Lai massacre, which also inflamed the American public protests. During this year, students from Columbia and Harvard also seized many school buildings and refused to attend class in protest of the war. In 1969, large-scale anti-war protests continued even after Nixon withdrew thousands of American troops from the region. This year was also notable because of the famous attacks from the left-wing group known as the Weathermen. This group was very extreme as they planted bombs and sabotaged government property in protest of the war. In the fall of 1969, hundreds of thousands of protesters met in Washington, D.C., and the very day after that protest, only one participant of the My Lai massacre was found guilty, and he was only given a 10-year sentence. These actions further inflamed the American public to dislike the war. In 1970, 4 students were killed at Kent State University, and 2 students were killed at Jackson State College. These killings sparked demonstrations across the country. By 1971, massive protests were still happening, and veterans began to throw away their medals in a show of support for the anti-war movement. During this year, the famous Pentagon Papers were also released, which exposed government strategies in Vietnam. In 1972, protests continued, and Jane Fonda, who is a prominent anti-war protester, visited Vietnam. This year ended on the eve of a peace treaty, and direct U.S. involvement ended in 1973.